What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? The 2030 Project is a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it. We endeavor to uncover what has been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy and then what needs to come next. The 2030 Project will tackle some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing Canada today. In this episode, we confront the monumental challenges and the complications that need to be wrestled to the ground if we're really going to put a serious dent in poverty rates in this country. Welcome to the program. I'm Dave Trafford. To provide some perspective and context, we are joined today by Talia Bronstein. She's the Vice President of Research and Advocacy at Daily Bread Food Bank. Garima Talwar Kapoor, Director of Policy and Research with Maytree, and Jasmine Ramze Rezaee, Director of Advocacy and Communications at YWCA Toronto. Now, there is a national strategy in place, and in fact, it's being implemented right now. Garima Talwar Kapoor says it's based on some goals that are necessarily lofty and ambitious.
Yeah, I think that when the Liberal government came in 2015, they set out an ambitious path to develop Canada's first poverty reduction strategy. And as part of that, they outlined three different pillars: dignity, opportunity and inclusion, and resilience and security. And I think what the government wanted to do is sort of talk about addressing the issues that people living in deep poverty experience, wanted to, as they say in their own words, help ensure that people can move from low income into middle incomes and help protect people from falling from middle incomes into low income. And I think that as a pillar of the government's strategy, or foundational to the government strategy, was twofold. They introduced the Canada Child Benefit, which built upon previous child benefits like the Universal Childcare Benefit. And what that's done is deeply reduced the level of poverty amongst children and families with children across Canada. And then another pillar was, or another foundational element was enhancing the working income tax benefit into the Canada Workers Benefit to really help those that have low incomes sort of get that bump up that would help them maybe make ends meet. And so, but with that, with the CWB, you've seen a goal towards addressing shallow poverty. And I put that in quotations. Nobody can see this on the podcast, but you're really addressing people that are just hovering around the poverty line and not really addressing the needs of people living in deep poverty. And I think to address people living in deep poverty outside of the investments in the Canada Child Benefit, the government's decided to make significant investments through the National Housing Strategy, because we know that housing is absolutely critical to well-being, security, amongst other things. But I think that was several years ago. And now if we're in this post-pandemic, almost post-pandemic future, we need to think about whether those investments still make sense and how we build upon them. The government's actually achieved many of their goals in terms of poverty reduction as laid out in 2015. And so we need to actually dig deeper and move deeper into reducing the level of poverty that people experience.
So, and I think all of that, you're right, Garima, when we talk about it in a very broad sense. But Jasmine, we know that those who live in poverty quite literally live hand to mouth. In many cases, it's just not about a 2-week paycheck. It's a day-to-day, how do I manage my routine, my food, everything else to make certain that they're going to see the end of the month and be relatively, and I put mine in air quotes that you can't see, comfortable as well. So this long view is great in terms of being able to say we need to make a generational shift here. But reconcile that with somebody who's living in subsidized housing right now and doesn't quite know if they're going to have enough in the bank to make sure that they can pay for their cell phone, and that's not a luxury for anybody anymore.
Yeah, that's such a good point. When we did our poverty reduction consultations last year, we actually went into many of our programs and sites. YWCA Toronto offers more than 30 programs, and we offer shelters and housing. We're actually one of the leading housing providers for women and women-led families. And it became so apparent that there are a huge segment really of our society of women who are currently accessing our shelter system because they can't afford rental housing, and they are on wait lists for affordable housing. And in the words of one of the women we spoke to, how can you expect me to get my life together on $343 a month? Which is the sort of basic needs portion of OW, Ontario Works for a single person on welfare. And so what we're having is these provincial income security systems, like in Ontario, but across Canada, that are really inadequate for where people are at today. And these poverty alleviation mechanisms, these provisions that are really intended to safeguard people's economic and social well-being, are actually by design keeping people really entrenched in these vicious cycles of poverty and keeping people really in our shelter system because they have nowhere else to go, and we can't create enough affordable housing quick enough. And, we're telling the province now has this whole plan about how the best job for a person on social assistance is a job. But there's so many life stabilization factors that need to be in place before someone can even consider employment. And so there are so many gaps currently. And you see the harm when you speak to folks and when you listen to community members. It's really disheartening, I think.
Talia, I know we've already touched on just about every subject we're going to get into in this series, so I'm glad to hear all of this conversation around it, whether it is about sort of that gap in income, that gap in access to services. We're going to end up talking about how infrastructure is so important to all of this. And I think that what this has done, Talia, is made people at this stage, just where we are in the, kind of coming out into the light after the pandemic, or at the end of the pandemic, as the case may be, where we're realizing, holy cow, there are a lot of things that we are going to have to address simultaneously. We have to have the whole band playing all together. We can't just have one going off and being a soloist here and a soloist there, if you will, because to get good housing, we need to have this happen, and to have, we need to have all of these things sort of fall in place together. And the hardest part might be getting all of these jurisdictions to sit up right at the same time, undivided attention, and address these issues.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I mean, I think the challenge is, of course, we have a federal poverty reduction strategy. Many provinces have provincial poverty reduction strategies. Many municipalities have poverty reduction strategies. But, government has never been known for streamlined communication. And, there's a lot of silos. And especially when it comes to different jurisdictions, I mean, the different levels are on different election cycles. There's different political parties in power with different philosophies. So it's really difficult to have everybody kind of moving in the same direction at the same time. And, I think Garima made a really important point that our poverty reduction strategy that we currently have in place at the national level, it reflects a time period that may no longer exist. We don't know what the return to quote unquote normalcy is going to look like. And I think that we need to really learn from the pandemic. The pandemic has shown us a lot of the failings of our social safety net. For example, employment insurance. I mean, a lot of people knew for a long time that employment insurance wasn't reflecting the modern realities of work. And the pandemic, sort of really brought that to light, because all of a sudden we're seeing unprecedented unemployment. And so there's been some really rapid changes in our social safety net, for example, to employment insurance. Of course, the Canada Recovery Benefits, CERB, and the ones that came after that. So I think we need to, it's a good moment to kind of take a step back and start thinking, what do we want this system to look like? What have we learned? And what are we going to do differently now that we hopefully, fingers crossed, the pandemic has settled down. So we actually have the time and space to think not just about the immediacy of a health crisis, but in terms of how do we want to build a more healthy, resilient society moving forward?
So Jasmine, I think that one of the things that so many people will look at here is, this is going to cost us a fortune. We're already talking about, billions of dollars being committed back in 2015. And to Talia's point, does that mean anything now based on the crushing deficits that we're facing because of COVID-19? And we can't blame that on anybody, but that's the reality of where we are. But we bring it back to this, one of the pillars that Garima pointed out was talking about opportunity and inclusion. And what struck me about that is the need to help Canadians join the middle class. We talk all the time about the middle class this, the middle class that, and we kind of have our own view of what the middle class is. But I don't think people have a sense of the diminishing nature of the middle class. We have to turn that tide, I think, maybe first. That has to be one of the top priorities. Turn that tide first. Include more people in the middle class. Then, to your point, it makes it easier. Life is more stable for education, for housing, for jobs. And then we kind of get ourselves on the right path.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I love your metaphor of this band, because it really is a dance. And there's there is a disjointedness now. And I don't think it's due to malice. It really isn't. I think it's due to various historic reasons. And so we're in this situation, right? And so COVID now has exposed and exacerbated these inequities, right? It's exposed the precarity of our workforce, and particularly the working conditions of the care economy, right? These are feminized industries that employ primarily women, and a large share of those women are newcomers and racialized, and they are working in these low paying jobs on the front lines, doing essential work, and often with few benefits and no job security. So what we're seeing in Ontario is this rise of growing working poor, this segment of the labor market where people have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And because of the pandemic, many people also lost their jobs, and they were pushed out of the workforce because of caregiving, unpaid care responsibilities at home, right? So we have this whole, this idea of this she session and how it's disproportionately impacted women and other folks. And because of the economic stratification in our society, when you look at who it's impacting, when we're thinking of poverty, it is gendered and it is racialized. And then to Garima's point, COVID is showing us what the government is capable of, because it is capable of swift intervention. CERB set this amazing benchmark, $2,000 a month. Which is costly for sure. But when we think of folks now having to live on $733 a month, and that discrepancy between what the federal government is thinking it's, sufficient to survive on versus what the province assumes is sufficient to survive on, and the fact that there has been really no change in these rates and the cost of living has risen. I mean, one of the best and most effective policy tools we have to date is simply, in my opinion, to improve the rates, because that would take a whole segment of society that is dealing with deep poverty out of that economic predicament, right? And what we need are stronger labor market laws. There's a huge segment of our society who are working in our economy who don't have access to minimum working standards because they are either not immigrants, or they have precarious immigration status, or they're working in these kind of quasi non-worker fields in the gig economy where they don't have access to basic, they're not covered by provincial employment standards. And so those are all things we need to address if we're going to talk about poverty. We can't have gender or racial equality or equity in our society or true inclusion without economic justice and changing some of the ways that our market is functioning currently.
So, Garima, when you started off, you said there are some positives and we can point to benchmarks where these programs work. We have seen, sharp decreases in, for example, child poverty. So in some cases, the plan has been on the right track. But I think each of you now has made it very clear that COVID has laid bare the need to look at this in a multidimensional way. We need to expand our peripheral vision, if you will, in terms of how we look at poverty. And, I talked to some people who said, to Jasmine's point, indexing the benefit would be a great start that we don't do. So give me the one thing, and I realize that this is a huge problem and an issue we're tackling off the bat, but I think we need to do one at a time because it's that complicated. So let's not lose focus. If you were to have the one thing you think we need to add to our plan that is going to enhance the plan, what do you think that priority should be?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Well, if we think about that working age adults, especially unattached singles, so singles without kids, face the highest rates of poverty in Canada today. About just over 1 in 3 single adults lives in poverty in Canada. The best thing we can do for them, in addition to stronger labor protections and an expansion of basic services, is to develop a federal benefit amount that is transferred to them, just like the Canada Child Benefit or the Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors. Right now, there's a lot of discussion around, quote, basic income. And without getting into a debate about basic income, I think that it's important to think about basic incomes so that you meet people and communities where they are. And so if you develop this base benefit from the federal government, just like we do with the CCB or GIS, and enable people living in poverty who receive social assistance to stack up their benefits, it would help to dramatically reduce the depth of poverty that people are experiencing. And again, we need to be really careful that we're not thinking about policy tools that just edge people out of that poverty line, right? That's a lot of math. And you can change program parameters slightly to make claims that 100,000 more people are being pushed out of poverty. But it takes really hard work to address that depth of poverty question. And the feds have to get back into this world. They've abdicated their responsibility for decades to this group of people, and it's time for them to come back.
All right, Jasmine, Garima has taken the basic income large envelope as the one thing that she wants the plan to focus on. Where would you take it?
I would say just an improvement of our labor standards and ensuring that all workers, regardless of immigration status or employment industry, have access to minimum working conditions. I think that there are a lot of folks who are historically excluded or marginalized or on the periphery of our labor market. And this is a growing segment of society. And we need to figure out a better way to offer meaningful employment opportunities where a minimum wage reflects a living wage for all workers, so that if you're working full-time in our society, if you're performing an essential service, if you're helping food, arrive on someone's plate, if you're picking strawberries in a field, it doesn't really matter, that you have access to some basic employment standards, enough income really to live decently, or at least pay for housing to some degree, and live with some dignity. I think we're talking about basic human dignity. So I think addressing some of these gaps in the labor market and improving working conditions can go a long way in supporting some poverty reduction measures.
So I don't want to preclude or guess that what you might say, Talia, but what we're talking about here, on the one hand, is the financial side of it but I'm glad Jasmine brought up dignity, because it's the sort of the first pillar of the plan, is what we want to guarantee. And I wonder how much of that is financial, or how much of that is a systemic approach to our plan to reduce poverty. I don't know. But anyway, I will leave it to you to come up with your priority.
Well, I'll just start by saying the dignity piece is absolutely both. You can't have dignity on below poverty incomes, and you can't have dignity when you're being forced to jump through all sorts of hoops to just have a basic standard of living where you can afford a roof overhead and food on your plate. So I think dignity really has both sides of that coin. But in terms of kind of my one thing, I'm glad I get to go last, because, I think we've covered, Garima has talked about the importance of income supports, targeted income supports specifically. Jasmine's talked about labor market and how to make sure that there's decent work and value given to work that's being done. And so I will say that in addition to those things, I think the last pillar is basic services. So childcare, pharmacare, making sure we have adequate public transportation systems across the country. These are the things that, these end up being expenses people pay out of pocket when you don't have health insurance, or, childcare is incredibly expensive. Public transit in a city like Toronto specifically is actually quite costly compared to other places. So these are if we can address these as universal basic services for everyone, it actually not only helps eliminate poverty, but it benefits everybody. I mean, I would certainly know that I would see a benefit in my life and people I know's life as well. So I think the basic services is the last piece of the puzzle.
So the policy issues are fairly clear. Our thanks to Talia Bronstein, Garima Talwar Kapoor, and Jasmine Ramze Rezaee for joining us in this episode. The pillars of the plan are reasonably well defined. But what happens when we lift the policy off the page and look at how it plays out in the lives of those who try to navigate the system? Can they do so with dignity? Can they do so with any hope of rising above the physical and psychological constraints of poverty? We'll get a glimpse of that lived experience that's coming up in the next episode of the 2030 Project. So thanks for listening. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple, Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'll also be grateful if you would offer a rating on the show, and we'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank. It's a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is an Eye Contact production.